Everybody, this is Perch. I've talked in the past about how the 90s were just really painful for comic shops, and it was a very painful time to be through as a comic fan and as just trying to run a business. This comic industry, the 90s hurt. And I realized, because I've gotten some questions, why do you feel that way? Because there's plenty of people out there who absolutely love the 90s, who to them the 90s was their entry point into comics. And so that's typically speaking, where however you came into comics, when you really started from just casually maybe reading a comic or two to collecting, whatever that moment in your life was, that tends to be the fondest memory you have of comics. That tends to be what you gravitate to, and it makes sense, right? You pick up a hobby, you start investing into something. I mean, you wouldn't do that if you were pissed and hated what you're doing, so it makes sense. So for a lot of people, especially people really kind of in their 30s now, the 90s was their time. And so you have a lot of channels where they really kind of revere the 90s, and there's almost this kind of angry pushback of people who say the 90s were problematic, are bad in some way, or like that they're trying to destroy comics or whatever it might be. But there are some tangible reasons why the 90s were a problem. So I want to explain a few of those right now. And again, this isn't to bash up the 90s. In fact, the one thing I will say is there's a lot of very memorable comics, a lot of careers and things that were launched then that have persisted to today. I mean, like Spawn is a comic that obviously it launched in the 90s, and it remains strong now. And it's had a rebirth in a lot of cases. It fell in sales and it's come back up. And so you can't say like there's content in the 90s that are brilliant. I really enjoyed the birth of Vertigo and a lot of what they did in the 90s. I thought that independent comics, a lot of what they did was great. I'd be lying if I said I didn't absolutely love what Mark Silvestri and Jim Lee and those guys were doing over at Marvel. Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man is brilliant. There's a lot of great work. And Michael Mignola put out some amazing stuff. The Gotham by Gaslight, the Dracula series that was done. I mean, there's some great 90s comics, and you can't take that away. Even if the 90s as a business were problematic, it doesn't mean that those comics were bad. In fact, I mean, those comics remain brilliant. And a lot of people remain brilliant, talent. But there were some bad things. And the biggest of which I talk about from time to time. And in many cases, it's weird because I see almost this repeat of a lot of things happening, especially with corporate comics. And when I say corporate comics, I'm really talking Marvel and DC, where they're doing very similar things to what was done in the 90s. And I notice a lot of people, myself included, are like they're putting up warning signs like, hey, be careful. Don't do that. This tanked the industry the last time. And there's fans who are like, what are you talking about? Get out of here. I'm like the X-Men whole conversation. It's like, get out of here. These comics are great. If you don't like them, don't buy them. And all. It's like, that's not what I'm saying. It's like, and this was very much a problem in the 90s, going to excess, doing a lot of spin-offs, taking something that was popular, in which case in, the modern equivalent, House of X Powers of 10 was popular. I liked it. I liked it very much. The reviews are on my site. I was very into it. And having all of these titles spinning off, it should give most normal, sane people pause that they're putting out all these books. And the response of, well, if you don't like it, don't buy it. You don't have to buy it. It's like, yeah, that's true. Of course it's true. You don't have to buy it. But if it's done wrong, it can also blow up the industry. It could blow up comics. And, for those of us who have been around for a while, we don't really want comics to get blown up. We're not saying this because, maybe it's not that people have a hate boner for Teenie Howard. I mean, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't. But it's like I don't really want to see 5X titles released over the next couple months. That's going to cause the whole thing to blow up. I don't want to repeat the 90s. So that was something that definitely happened in the 90s, was excess. And another thing that happened in the 90s that we're struggling with right now is is schedule delays and slips and really crazy shipping schedules that in many cases it blew up it blew up the industry. You didn't know when comics were coming out. It killed a lot of momentum. And what we're seeing right now, in particular with Marvel and a lot of schedule delays and things just randomly kind of coming out. And so, for example, if you were into New Warriors, if that title looked exciting to you, now I don't mean to roast it on your YouTube channel. I mean just like you were legitimately intrigued by this premise and you wanted to see this book come out. The book is in limbo. As I said in the other video, I do believe it is going to come out. I'm doing really well, by the way. Since that video occurred, I said that Silk was probably likely, and they did announce it's gonna go. And I said that American Chavez was 100% likely, and it's officially coming out in March. So I'm feeling good. So far, I'm 2-0, but we'll see how the rest of it goes. At any rate, it, delays and cancellations and titles getting announced and then not coming out for a long time, it has a very detrimental effect. If you like, people like reliability. They like, whether they love the title or they hate the title, they like the confidence that the title and when it's shipping and when it's coming out is going to be reliable. And what we're seeing, our schedules are way more fluid than they used to be. And one of the things that the 90s had, there was this lead up to a lot of the schedule problems. And the lead up started like this, and see if this sounds familiar to you. Titles just started softly slipping for no apparent reason, and then also double shipping for no apparent reason. So you had books that would ship two issues in a month. That was not really expected, and you weren't really sure why the company was doing this. It kind of shipped 2 titles in a month, and then it went 6 weeks, and then there was no title, and then there was another one, and then 4 weeks, and then another 8 weeks, and then 2 weeks, and it just the shipping felt very, very random. And in the early 90s, this was starting to happen a lot, where the books were coming out very, very randomly, and then there'd be these long delays that seemed to have no apparent reason for them. Because you had creators who were still putting out books, both the writer and the artist, and it was really unclear why the schedule, why was it getting delayed? While this book's coming out, we see the writer putting out other titles. We see the artist putting out other titles. Like, what's going on with this one? Why is it seemingly randomly delayed? Are the people just not wanting to deal with it, or are they tired of that book? Anyway, this was a real problem. So in the 90s, this ultimately led to really massive delays. And in some cases, you had Image solicit titles and then be like a year late. And when the title finally came in, it had cooled significantly in the market. And then retailers are stuck with hundreds of copies of like Brigade #1. And you're like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this now, because the extreme line of Image is not nearly as hot as it was. And I do, by the way, if you haven't listened to Rob Liefeld's podcast, it's a good one. He goes over a lot of really good stuff. One thing I haven't heard him touch on, though, that I would like for him to is while some of that stuff was great and he was putting up great numbers, there were some delays with some of those titles that were really severe. And they had this net effect of really killing a lot of momentum. And why? Like, what was behind that delay? It's never been very clear why some of the books were delayed as long as they were. The other thing that happened in the 90s is people got into doing things they were not prepared to do. And the biggest example of that was Marvel buying Heroes World and then trying to become their own publisher or their own distributor. And they had they clearly had no idea what they were doing. To the point that you've heard that expression, the phones are melting down. This is a literally, the phones melted down. The phones in the stores calling Marvel collapsed. Like they overheated and collapsed, like physically. That was not a figure of speech. It was an actual problem that happened. And this was a lot of businesses kind of getting into other ventures or related connections or merchandising or marketing or things they were not prepared to do. They did not know how to do it. They either deluded themselves into thinking they could, or they were too arrogant to not realize it was hard work, or actually took knowledge to do some of this stuff, and it completely blew up in their face. That's another problem in the 90s, and again, you're seeing some of that now. The problem that I have, and where a lot of my trepidation for the current comic industry and where it's headed, is that a lot of the problems we're seeing right now with very random delays, the companies getting into things they're clearly not prepared to get into, overabundance of titles, and then the other one that happened a lot in the '90s that was a problem was a reliance on gimmicks, and the reliance on gimmicks wasn't the problem in itself. It was the fact that it fueled speculators coming in believing that these gimmicks were going to lead to college funds for their children, and that created a just a crazy bubble of comics that should not have sold at the level they were selling at, and then ultimately the collectors kind of all walking away suddenly when it was clear this stuff wasn't going to land anywhere good. And we see a little bit of that now. You see the variant cover kind of bubble. It really does feel like a bubble. It does not feel like collectors who are kind of picking and choosing the covers they like because they want to follow a particular artist. It feels a lot more like a bubble. It feels like something that's going to burst. And I think that's where you look at what happened back then, and you look what happened today, and it is a definite problem. And I think the last thing that was really indicative of the '90s is the '90s was starting to get its first taste of the internet. And so you had AOL message boards, and you had the Usenet, you had other places, and very few people were using that stuff. Compared to today and social networks now, you're talking about like a 1/100th of the audience. But that audience was, dealing with the internet and being able to communicate with somebody where there are no consequences for the first time, and a bunch of people immediately start acting like insane assholes. And you saw a lot of really very angry fights. And it's funny because I ran across an article in the Comic Book Resources, the newsletter, that's talking about toxic online fans, and it's from '94, and it's hilarious now to read it. You're like, oh my God, there's even a line in this article where they're talking about people are taking out their AOL discs that they got in the mail and going online to start fights. And it's like, AOL discs. Anyway, get those 50 free hours and use them to be an asshole and have sex chats. That's what you want to do. But it's funny because if you pile all these things up, you see a ton of parallels to today. Now it's not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination that we're going to get the same thing, but none of those were good things in the '90s, and I think there like I said at the beginning, there were obviously a lot of really great comics, really great creators, great things that I love about that era. Absolutely. But the business and the things that I just mentioned were definitely sucked. And they combined did come really close to toppling this whole business. I mean, it's funny how many people I mentioned. It's like, hey, what about that time that Marvel filed for bankruptcy? Do you remember that? Do you remember that time? Because that was the thing. That was that. Yeah, I don't think we're heading on the 30-year anniversary of that, the 25-year anniversary of that. We are heading toward there, and there's a lot of moments where comics teetered. I mean, there was a definite close call where there would be no comics like we know of it today. There'd still be comics for sure, but we talk about casually, what's going on with Nick Spencer's Spider-Man, or Marvel producing all these Dawn of X titles, or DC saying hold my beer, look at them all these Batman books and all the rest. Where there's a time 25 years ago where it was unclear whether we'd see any of these books again. Like we flirted with this business being over. And so when I can't help it, when I see a lot of the same things cropping up now, it's like I'm like, I don't know. I mean, let's be careful. I still got some scars. Let's watch out a little bit. So anyway, that's I mean, in a nutshell, I think there's plenty of good videos that go into really careful detail, like I do with the business numbers, around some of these things, and you can get some real heavy stats. But that's a little bit of what was going on in the '90s and why it was a tricky era, and a little bit why some people react the way they do on certain things that are happening today. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications. Most importantly, though, thanks for listening.